Chapter 2. Man, a living being. Needs and capacities. From the simplest unicellular animal to man, the most complex of organisms, all living entities possess a characteristic structure, the component parts of which function in such a way as to preserve the integrity of that structure, thereby maintaining the life of the organism. An organism has been described, correctly, as being not an aggregate, but an integrate. When an organism ceases to perform the actions necessary to maintain its structural integrity, it dies. Death is disintegration. When the life of the organism ends, what remains is merely a collection of decomposing chemical compounds. For all living entities, action is a necessity of survival. Life is motion, a process of self-sustaining action that an organism must carry on constantly in order to remain in existence. This principle is equally evident in the simple energy conversions of the plant and in the long-range, complex activities of man. Biologically, inactivity is death. The action that an organism must perform is both internal, as in the process of metabolism, and external, as in the process of seeking food. The pattern of all self-preserving action is, in essence, as follows. An organism maintains itself by taking materials which exist in its environment, transforming or rearranging them, and thereby converting them into the means of its own survival. Consider the processes of nutrition, respiration, and synthesis, which, together with their related functions, comprise metabolism. Through the process of nutrition, the raw materials the organism needs are brought into its system. Through respiration, oxidation, energy is then extracted from these raw materials. A part of this energy is then used in the process of synthesis, which transforms the raw materials into structural components of living matter. The remaining energy, together with all the structural components, makes possible the continuation of the organism's self-maintaining activity. Metabolism characterizes all living species. But now consider an example of the wider principle involved, that is peculiar to man, the activity of harnessing a waterfall in order to obtain the electric energy needed to power a factory engaged in the manufacture of farm equipment or clothing or automobiles or drugs. Here, the action is external rather than internal, behavioral rather than metabolic, but the basic principle of life remains the same.
The existence of life is conditional. An organism always faces the possibility of death. Its survival depends on the fulfillment of certain conditions. It must generate the biologically appropriate course of action. What course of action is appropriate is determined by the nature of the particular organism. Different species survive in different ways. An organism maintains itself by exercising its capacities in order to satisfy its needs. The actions possible to and characteristic of a given species are to be understood in terms of its specific needs and capacities. These constitute its basic behavioral context. Need and a capacity are used here in their fundamental, metaphysical sense. By metaphysical, I mean pertaining to the nature of things. In this context, need and capacity refer to what which is innate and universal to the species, not to that which is acquired and peculiar to the individual. An organism's needs are those things which the organism, by its nature, requires for its life and well-being, i.e., for its efficacious continuation of the life process. An organism's capacities are its inherent potentialities for action. The concept of needs and capacities is fundamental to biology and psychology alike. Biology is concerned with the needs and capacities of living organisms qua physical entities. Psychology is concerned with the needs and capacities of living organisms qua conscious entities. Just as man possesses specific psychological capacities, by virtue of his distinctive form of consciousness, his conceptual faculty, so, by virtue of this same faculty, he possesses specific psychological needs. I shall discuss some of these needs in Part 2. When a physical or psychological need fails to be fulfilled, the result is danger to the organism, pain, debilitation, destruction. However, needs differ, a, in the degree of their temporal urgency, and b, in the form of the threat which they potentially pose. This is most easily seen in the case of physical needs, but the principle applies to all needs. A man has a need of oxygen and of food, but whereas he can survive for days without food, he can survive for only minutes without oxygen. Man can survive much longer without vitamin C than without water, but both are needs. In some cases, the frustration of a need results in immediate death. In other cases, the process can take years. B. Man has a need to maintain his body temperature at a certain level. He has internal adaptive mechanisms which adjust to changes in the external environment. If he is exposed to extreme temperatures beyond the power of his adaptive mechanisms to cope with, he suffers pain and, within a few hours, dies. In such a case, the disastrous consequences of need, frustration are direct and readily discernible, similarly with oxygen deprivation, food deprivation, etc. But there are instances of need frustration in which the sequence of disaster is much less direct. For example, man has a need of calcium. There are regions in Mexico where the soil contains no calcium. The inhabitants of these regions do not perish outright, but their growth is stunted, they are generally debilitated, and they are prey to many diseases to which the lack of calcium makes them highly susceptible. They are impaired in their general ability to function. Thus, a need frustration does not have to result in the organism's destruction directly. Instead, it can undermine the organism's overall capacity to live, and thus make the organism vulnerable to destruction from many different sources. This principle is important to remember in considering the frustration of psychological needs. We will have occasion to recall it in Chapter 12.
Science comes to discover man's various needs through the consequences that occur when they are frustrated. Needs announce themselves through signals of pain, illness, and death. If somehow, a need were always and everywhere satisfied automatically, if no one ever suffered from any frustration of the need, it is difficult to surmise how scientists would be able to isolate and identify it. Even when symptoms do appear, it is often a long process to discover the underlying need deprivation. Men died of scurvy for many centuries before scientists traced the causal connection to a lack of green vegetables. And only in comparatively recent history did they learn that the crucial ingredient supplied by the vegetables is vitamin C. Man is an integrated organism, and it is not surprising that the frustration of physical needs sometimes produces psychological symptoms, and that the frustration of psychological needs sometimes produces physical symptoms. As an example of the first, the hallucinations and loss of memory that can result from a deficiency of thiamine. As an example of the second, any psychosomatic illness, migraine headaches, peptic ulcers, etc. It is the conditional nature of life that gives rise to the concept of need. If a being were indestructible, if it were not confronted with the alternative of life or death, it would have no needs. The concept could not be applicable to it. Without the concept of life, the concept of need would not be possible. Need implies the existence of a goal, result, or end, the survival of the organism. Therefore, in order to maintain that something is a physical or psychological need, one must demonstrate that it is a causal condition of the organism's survival and well-being. While biologists recognize this fact, many psychologists do not. They ascribe to men a wide variety of psychological needs, without offering any justification for their claims, as though the positing of needs were a matter of arbitrary choice. They seldom specify by what criterion they judge what are or are not needs, nor do they show how or why their lists of alleged needs are entailed by man's nature as a living organism. Among the things that various psychologists have asserted to be inherent needs of man are the following: to dominate other men, to submit to a leader, to bargain, to gamble, to gain social prestige, to snub someone, to be hostile, to be unconventional, to be a conformist, to deprecate oneself, to boast, to murder, to suffer pain. These so-called needs, it must be emphasized, are held by their advocates to be innate and universal to the human species.
A desire or a wish is not the equivalent of a need. The fact that a great many men may desire a thing does not prove that it represents a need inherent in human nature. Needs must be objectively demonstrable. This should be obvious. But there are few facts that have been more recklessly ignored by most psychologists. Perhaps the most remarkable need ever posited by a psychologist is the one propounded by Sigmund Freud in his theory of the death instinct. According to Freud, human behavior is to be understood in terms of instincts, specifically, the life instinct and the death instinct. The latter is the more powerful, says Freud, since all men eventually do die. These instincts, he claims, represent innate biological needs. Man has a biological need to experience pain and to perish. In every cell of man's body there is a will to die, an urge to return to an inorganic condition, to re-establish a state of things which was disturbed by the emergence of life. This theory represents the extreme of what can happen when psychologists permit themselves to speculate about needs while ignoring the context in which the concept arises and the standard by which needs are to be established. A need is that which an organism requires for its survival. The consequence of frustrating a need is pain and/or death. The postulate of a death instinct, of a need to die, of a need to experience pain, is literally meaningless. It is only on the premise of life as the goal that the concept of a biological need can be meaningful. The concept of a need to die, like the concept of a square circle, is a contradiction in terms. If man fails to fulfill his actual needs, nature threatens him with pain and death. But what does nature threaten him with if he fails to fulfill his alleged need to suffer and die? To move from the observation that all living things die to the conclusion that there exists within every cell of man's body a will to die is grotesque anthropomorphism. And to speak of an organism's urge to return to an inorganic condition, to re-establish a state of things which was disturbed by the emergence of life, is to be guilty of the crudest violation of logic. An organism does not exist prior to its existence, it cannot return to non-existence, it cannot be disturbed by the emergence of itself. Beyond the pleasure principle, the monograph in which Freud presents his theory of the death instinct is surely one of the most embarrassing productions in all psychological literature. While the task of isolating and identifying man's physical needs is far from completed, biology has made enormous advances in this direction. With regard to the task of isolating and identifying man's mental needs, psychology is in a state of chaos. This chaos serves, however, to emphasize the fact that the nature of man's needs has to be discovered. Needs are not self-evident. Alleged needs must be proven by relating them to the requirements of man's survival. That man possesses psychological needs is indisputable. The widespread phenomenon of mental illness is evidence both of the existence of needs, which are being thwarted, and of the failure of psychology to understand the nature of these needs.
Needs, goals, and instincts. The psychologist, seeking to understand the principles of human behavior, observes that man, as a biological entity, possesses various needs, and that man characteristically acts to achieve various ends or goals. It is the existence of needs that creates the necessity of action, i.e., of goal-seeking. Even when the goals a particular man selects are incompatible with his needs, so that he is pursuing a course of self-destruction, this principle still remains true. The basic problem of motivational psychology may be formulated as follows: to bridge the gap between needs and goals, to trace the steps from the former to the latter, to understand the connection between them, i.e., to understand how needs get translated into goals. It should be obvious that the solution of this problem requires a consideration of man's distinctive capacities. Yet in large measure, the history of motivational psychology represents an attempt to bypass man's most distinctively human capacity, his conceptual faculty, and to account for his behavior without reference to the fact that man can reason, or that his mind is his basic means of survival. The behaviorist projection of man as a stimulus-response machine is one version of this attempt. The projection of man as a conscious automaton, activated by instincts, is another. The function which the concept of demon served for the primitive savage and the concept of God serves for the theologian is served for many psychologists by the concept of instinct, a term denoting nothing scientifically intelligible, while creating the illusion of causal understanding. What a savage could not comprehend, he explained by postulating a demon. What a theologian cannot comprehend, he explains by postulating a God. What many psychologists cannot comprehend, they explain by postulating an instinct.
Instinct is a concept intended to bridge the gap between needs and goals, bypassing man's cognitive, i.e., reasoning and learning, faculty. As such, it represents one of the most disastrous and sterile attempts to deal with the problem of motivation. Instinct theory enjoyed an enormous vogue in the 18th and 19th centuries and in the early years of the 20th. Although its influence has been declining for the past several decades, it is still a major pillar of the orthodox Freudian school of psychoanalysis. Observing certain types of behavior which they believe to be characteristic of the human species, instinct theorists decided that the causes of such behavior are innate, unchosen, and unlearned tendencies which drive man to act as he does. Thus, they spoke of a survival instinct, a parental instinct, an acquisitive instinct, a pugnacity instinct, and so forth. They seldom attempted to define precisely what they understood an instinct to be, still less did they trouble to explain how it functioned. They vied with one another in compiling lists of the instincts their particular theory assumed man to possess, promising to account thereby for the ultimate sources of all human action. The most prominent of these theorists were William James, William McDougall, and Sigmund Freud. Instinct, writes James, is the faculty of acting in such a way as to produce certain ends, without foresight of the ends, and without previous education in the performance. We may, then, writes McDougall, define instinct as an inherited or innate psychophysical disposition which determines its possessor to perceive, and to pay attention to, objects of a certain class, to experience an emotional excitement of a particular quality upon perceiving such an object, and to act in regard to it in a particular manner, or, at least, to experience an impulse to such action. If these definitions are less than illuminating, Freud's formulation is outstanding in its unclarity. Freud writes of instinct as a borderland concept between the mental and the physical, being both the mental representative of the stimuli emanating from within the organism and penetrating to the mind, and at the same time a measure of the demand made upon the energy of the latter in consequence of its connection with the body. In spite of the central role that instincts play in his system, this is as close as Freud ever comes to a definition. That mysterious force, instinct, is not a thought or an action or an emotion or a need. The attempt, on the part of some theorists, to identify an instinct as a compound reflex has been recognized as unsupportable and has collapsed. A reflex is a specific, definable neurophysiological phenomenon, the existence of which is empirically demonstrable. It is not a dumping ground for ununderstood behavior. To account for man's actions in terms of undefinable instincts is to contribute nothing to human knowledge. It is only to confess that one does not know why man acts as he does. To observe that men engage in sexual activities and to conclude that man has a sex instinct, to observe that men seek food when they are hungry and to conclude that man has a hunger instinct, to observe that some men act destructively and to conclude that man has a destructive instinct, to observe that men usually seek out one another's company and to conclude that man has a gregarious instinct, is to explain nothing. It is merely to place oneself in the same epistemological category as the physician in the anecdote who explains to a distraught mother that the reason why her child will not drink milk is that the child is just not a milk drinker. The history of instinct theory, in the past 50 years, is the history of intense efforts, on the part of its supporters, to twist the meaning of language, of their formulations and of the facts of reality, in order to protect their doctrines from science's growing recognition that traits and activities alleged to be instinctive are either a, not universal to the species, but a product of particular men's acquired attitudes or beliefs, as in the case of pugnacity, or b, the product of learning, as in the case of sexual behavior, which is so simple for the organism to attain, that virtually all members of the species who develop normally exhibit it, and are, c, the product of the interaction of simple reflexes and learning, as in the case of an infant's sucking behavior.
The concept of instinct was first used to account for complex patterns of animal behavior, such as migratory, mating, and maternal behavior, that appeared inexplicable. But the concept is no less misleading when applied to animals. There are, in principle, three categories in terms of which animal behavior can be explained. 1. Actions which are neurophysiological responses to physical stimuli, i.e., reflexes, and which do not involve the faculty of consciousness, such as the patellar reflex, knee jerk, in response to tendon stretch. 2. Actions which are guided directly by an animal's pleasure-pain sensory apparatus, and which involve the faculty of consciousness but not a process of learning, such as moving toward warmth. Some students of animal behavior use the term instinct exclusively to designate behavior of this second category. When thus restricted in meaning, the use of the term may be defensible, but I am inclined to think it inadvisable, in view of the many other meanings historically associated with the term. At any rate, when I speak of instinct in this discussion, I refer to the term as it is commonly used by clinical psychologists and personality theorists, to cover a good deal more than behavior of this second category. 3. Actions which are the result of learning, such as hunting and fighting. Sometimes, and this is especially relevant to allegedly instinctive behavior, the learning is instantaneous, within a given context, and is virtually inescapable to all normal members of a species. This is one-trial learning, for instance, avoiding a traumatically painful stimulus after one encounter. Animal behavior that has not been traced to one of these categories, or, more usually, to some combination of them, has not been explained. The inadequacy of explanation via instincts is still more apparent when one considers the complex goal-seeking activity of man. Man is born with needs, but he is not born with a knowledge of those needs and of how to satisfy them. Some of his simpler, vegetative body maintenance needs are satisfied automatically, given the appropriate physical environment, by the function of his internal organs, such as the need of oxygen, which is satisfied by the automatic function of his respiratory system. But the broad range of his more complex needs, all those needs which require the integrated action of his total entity in relation to the external world, are not satisfied automatically. Man does not obtain food, shelter, or clothing by instinct. To grow food, to build a shelter, to weave cloth, requires consciousness, choice, discrimination, judgment. Man's body does not have the power to pursue such goals of its own volition. It does not have the power purposefully to rearrange the elements of nature, to reshape matter, independent of his consciousness, knowledge, and values. All purposeful action aims at the achievement of a value. Things which can satisfy needs become objects of action only when they are chosen, in some form, as values.
Value and action imply and necessitate each other. It is in the nature of a value that action is required to achieve and/or maintain it. It is in the nature of a consciously initiated action that its motive and purpose is the achievement and/or maintenance of a value. But values are not innate. Having no innate knowledge of what is true or false, man can have no innate knowledge of what is for him or against him, what is to be pursued or avoided, what is good for him or evil. Unsatisfied, unfulfilled needs can set up a state of tension or disquietude or pain in man, thus prompting him to seek biologically appropriate actions, such as protecting himself against the elements. But the necessity of learning what is the appropriate action cannot be bypassed. His body provides man only with signals of pain or pleasure, but it does not tell him their causes. It does not tell him how to alleviate one or achieve the other. That must be learned by his mind. Man must discover the actions his life requires. He has no instinct of self-preservation. It was not an instinct that enabled man to make fire, to build bridges, to perform surgery, to design a telescope. It was his capacity to think. And if a man chooses not to think, if he chooses to risk his life in senseless dangers, to close his eyes rather than open his mind at the sight of any problem, to seek escape from the responsibility of reason in alcohol or drugs, to act in willfully stubborn defiance of his own objective self-interest, he has no instinct that will force his mind to function, no instinct that will compel him to value his life sufficiently to do the thinking and perform the actions which his life requires. The flagrantly self-destructive practices in which so many men engage, and the suicidal course that characterizes so much of human history, are an eloquent refutation and mockery of the claim that man has an instinct of self-preservation. Recognizing some of the difficulties which an alleged instinct of self-preservation presents, Freud sought a way out of the dilemma by announcing that, in addition to possessing a life instinct, man also possesses a death instinct. This theory has largely fallen into disrepute. But his fellow instinct theorists have no right to laugh at Freud. If one is determined to account for human behavior by reference to instincts, and if, as virtually all instinct theorists do, one holds that man has an instinct of self-preservation, one might well feel compelled to posit a counteracting death instinct, in order to make men's actions explicable. If such a thing as an instinct could exist, it would have to be some sort of innate, automatic knowledge, some sort of frozen information inscribed in the nervous system at birth. Instinct theory thus amounts to a resurrection of the doctrine of innate ideas, which has been thoroughly discredited by both philosophy and biology as a legacy of mysticism. The mythology of instinct is disastrous to scientific theory, because, by offering a pseudo-explanation, it halts further inquiry and thus stands as an obstacle to a genuine understanding of the causes of human behavior. It should be discarded as the last, dying convulsion of medieval demonology. In place of recourse to such primitive constructs, motivational psychology requires an analysis of the implications of the fact that man's biological distinction and basic tool of need satisfaction is his rational faculty.